It started like any other day. Alex Parker, a 34-year-old marketing consultant, had spent his morning sipping coffee, scrolling through emails, and getting ready for another routine afternoon at work. His wife, Emily, was already gone off to her job as a real estate agent, or at least, that's what he had always believed. They had been married for 7 years, built a seemingly perfect life together, and shared everything, or so he thought. But one message changed everything. While clearing out some old files on their shared laptop, Alex stumbled upon a folder he didn't recognize. It was labeled with a single word, Raven. Something about it felt off. His hands hovered over the trackpad for a moment before curiosity won. The moment he clicked it open, his world shattered. The next morning, Alex woke up with a pit in his stomach. His mind replayed everything he had discovered the night before, and the more he thought about it, the less it made sense. Who was Emily when she wasn't with him? And more importantly, how had she managed to keep such a huge part of her life hidden? He needed proof, something concrete, something undeniable. So while Emily was in the shower, he grabbed the laptop again, determined to dig deeper. But when he opened the folder, labeled Raven, it was empty. Every file, every email, every transaction gone. His hands shook as he refreshed the screen, checked the recycle bin, searched every possible folder on the computer. Nothing. It was as if the evidence had vanished overnight. His stomach twisted. Had Emily found out? Had she somehow erased everything while he was asleep? He glanced toward the bathroom door, hearing the sound of running water, and for the first time in their marriage, he felt a sharp stab of fear. If she knew he had seen the files, what would she do next? His mind raced for answers. Maybe it was just a technical glitch, some weird software issue. But deep down, he knew better. Someone had deleted those files on purpose. Whether it was Emily or someone else, it meant one thing: he wasn't supposed to know the truth. But if they thought that would stop him, they were wrong. Determined to find another way, Alex started retracing Emily's steps. He checked their bank account, looking for any strange transactions, but everything seemed normal until he noticed something odd. A monthly withdrawal of exactly $4,200, always on the same day, always going to the same unfamiliar account. It wasn't for bills, wasn't for their mortgage, and certainly wasn't for anything he recognized. Where was that money going? And why had Emily never mentioned it? As he was about to take a screenshot, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. His pulse quickened as he hesitated, then finally answered. "Stop looking." The voice on the other end was low, firm, and completely unfamiliar. "Whatever you think you're going to find, leave it alone. This isn't your business." Alex's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the line went dead. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at his screen, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Someone knew he was looking. Someone was watching him. But who? And how much did they know? His first instinct was to confront Emily, demand answers, force her to explain herself. But if she had gone this far to keep secrets from him, she wouldn't just come clean because he asked. He needed to be careful. He needed to play along. That night, he smiled, acted normal, even kissed her goodnight, like he always did. But while she slept peacefully beside him, Alex was wide awake, his mind spiraling with questions. He didn't know who had just threatened him. He didn't know what Emily was really hiding. And worst of all, he didn't know if he could trust anyone anymore. But one thing was certain: whatever was happening, it was bigger than he ever imagined. And he was already in too deep to walk away now. Inside were dozens of photos, emails, and receipts, none of which made any sense. Emily, his sweet, loving wife, the woman who always had dinner ready and kissed him goodbye every morning, was living a life he never could have imagined. There were pictures of her in cities he had never visited, standing beside people he had never met. Bank statements from accounts he didn't know existed. A passport under a completely different name. And then, the email's long, intimate conversations with someone who clearly knew her, but spoke of a version of her that Alex didn't recognize. His heart pounded as he scrolled further, reading words that turned his stomach. Emily wasn't just keeping secrets. She was someone else entirely. At first, he told himself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it was an old account, something from before they met. Maybe she had taken a business trip she forgot to mention. Maybe, just maybe, this was all some kind of misunderstanding. But the deeper he dug, the harder it became to deny the truth. It was reckless, it was insane, and yet Alex knew he had no choice. Whoever this was, they knew something. And he was running out of leads. The Willow Diner was nearly empty when he arrived. A flickering neon sign buzzed in the dark, and the smell of burnt coffee and fried food hung in the air. He slid into a booth near the back, his eyes scanning the few late-night customers. Then she walked in. A woman mid-40s, sharp eyes, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She looked familiar, but Alex couldn't place her. She sat across from him without a word, resting her hands on the cracked tabletop. "Emily isn't who you think she is," she said quietly, her voice steady but urgent. Alex felt his stomach twist. "Who are you?" She hesitated, then sighed. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." She reached into her bag and slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "Look at this, and then tell me if you still think you know your wife." Alex unfolded it with shaky fingers, and his entire world tilted. It was a marriage certificate. Emily's name was there, clear as day. But next to it, under spouse, wasn't Alex's name. It was someone else's, dated just 5 years before they met. His head spun. This isn't possible." The woman gave him a knowing look. "I thought the same thing." Alex swallowed hard. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice quieter this time. She looked him in the eye and said, "Her first husband." The diner suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. This was insane. Impossible. But the paper in his hands was real. And if this woman was telling the truth, it meant Emily had been lying for much longer than Alex ever imagined. Before he could say another word, the woman's expression changed. She glanced toward the window, her face tightening with fear. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. Alex turned just in time to see headlights pull up outside. A black SUV. Tinted windows. Engine still running. The woman stood abruptly. "They know you're looking. You need to stop. Now." But Alex barely heard her. Because at that moment, the passenger door of the SUV opened and Emily stepped out. She wasn't supposed to be here. She wasn't supposed to know he was here. Yet there she was. And the look on her face made one thing painfully clear. She knew everything. Alex's heart pounded as he stared at Emily, standing beside the SUV. Her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made every unanswered question burn hotter inside him. And while that moment of confrontation sent shockwaves through the diner's quiet atmosphere, miles away a separate but equally unsettling chain of events was beginning to unfold that would further entangle everyone in a web of suspicion and danger. At the same time, Mark, a longtime friend and co-worker of Alex, who had quietly harbored concerns about Emily's mysterious past, found himself in the midst of his own bewildering crisis when his phone vibrated with a cryptic message in the dead of night. Reading simply, "They're coming for you too, trust no one," accompanied by an attachment of a grainy photograph showing Emily. In a context that defied everything he had believed about the woman he thought he knew. And as Mark's mind raced through a litany of possibilities, he recalled a series of odd occurrences over the past few weeks. A sudden, unexplained cancellation of a meeting with a person he had hoped could shed light on Emily's shadowy affiliations. A whispered warning from a mutual acquaintance who claimed to have once seen Emily meeting with a notorious figure from a long-forgotten scandal, and even a chance encounter with a stranger who mentioned A name, Blackwood, that resonated with a secret buried deep in his memory. A secret that hinted at betrayals and alliances stretching far beyond the confines of a troubled marriage, while Alex stood frozen at the diner, grappling with the impossibility of Emily's revelations and the palpable threat. In the air, Mark's discovery sent his own pulse racing as he began to question whether Emily's double life was part of a larger conspiracy that had reached into his own circle, and as both men faced their respective crossroads of truth and deception, they soon realized that every clue uncovered only deepened the mystery, leaving them to wonder if the signals, the warnings, and the inexplicable evidence were the handiwork of a single, elusive mastermind intent on keeping everyone in the dark, or if they were the result of a much more chaotic, intertwined betrayal that put not only their futures at risk, but also the very fabric of trust among all those caught in the storm, just as the black SUV's door closed with a foreboding finality, and the diner's neon lights flickered ominously. An unresolved twist loomed large. The threads of their separate stories were beginning to converge in ways none of them could have ever anticipated, setting the stage for a revelation that would upend everything they thought they knew about loyalty, identity, and the dangerous lengths some would go to protect their secrets. Alex barely had time to react before Emily started walking toward the diner, her expression unreadable, her movements too controlled, too deliberate, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her mind long before it ever happened. The woman across from him, the one who claimed to be Emily's first husband, had already slipped out of the booth, her chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor, before she rushed toward the back exit, muttering something under her breath that Alex barely caught. "You shouldn't have come." But he wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. His fingers clenched the marriage certificate still sitting on the table, the paper slightly crumpled from the way his hands had been shaking, and as Emily stepped through the door, his entire body tensed. He didn't know what he had expected: anger, maybe, or guilt, or even some desperate attempt at a lie to explain away the impossible truth staring him in the face. But she didn't give him any of that. She just smiled. "You're not supposed to be here, Alex," she said softly, sliding into the booth across from him, her tone disturbingly calm, as if they were just another married couple out for a late-night meal, as if she didn't know that the very foundation of their life together had just crumbled into something unrecognizable. Alex swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Neither are you." Something flickered in her eyes, something he couldn't quite name, but before he could push further, before he could demand answers or confront her about the empty folder, the vanishing files, the phone call that warned him to stop, something outside caught his attention. The black SUV was still idling by the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and for the first time, Alex noticed a second figure sitting in the driver's seat, barely visible behind the glare. Whoever they weren't looking at Emily. They were looking at him. A sharp, cold fear sliced through his chest. He had spent the past few days convincing himself that this was just a secret Emily had been keeping from him, a betrayal, a lie, a double life she hadn't meant for him to find out about. But now, sitting across from her, watching the way her fingers tapped absently against the tabletop, like she was waiting for something, he realized this was much, much bigger than that. Then, just as suddenly as she had arrived, Emily reached across the table and took his hand in hers. It was such a familiar gesture, so painfully normal, that for a second, Alex almost let himself believe that things were okay. But then she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You need to stop looking," she said, her fingers tightening around his. "For your own good." And just like that, she stood up, slipping out of the booth with practiced ease, and walked back toward the door without another word. Alex sat frozen, his mind racing, every instinct screaming at him to follow her, to demand answers, to shake the truth out of her if he had to. But before he could even move, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The screen lit up with a single message from an unknown number. "She's not the only one lying to you." A shiver ran down his spine. Then, without warning, the lights in the diner flickered, the hum of the neon sign outside stuttering for just a moment before everything around him fell into an eerie silence. And that was when Alex knew this wasn't just about Emily anymore. Alex's breath came shallow as the diner's lights flickered back to life, bathing the cracked linoleum floor in a dull yellow glow. He stared down at his phone, his pulse hammering against his ribs, the message still glaring on the screen. "She's not the only one lying to you." The words gnawed at him, twisting everything he thought he knew into something far more sinister. Who sent this? And more importantly, who else had been deceiving him? His mind reeled, combing through the past few days, the past few years even, trying to pinpoint what he had missed. But before he could make sense of any of it, the air in the diner shifted. A presence, a shadow moving toward him. He looked up and felt his stomach drop. Mark, his best friend, his confidant, the one person he still believed he could trust. And yet, as Mark slid into the booth across from him, there was something different about him. His face was tight, his jaw clenched just a little too hard, and his eyes that had always been filled with a quiet steadiness, now carried something else entirely. "Alex," Mark said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to talk." Now, Alex could barely form the words. The threads of their separate stories were beginning to converge in ways none of them could have ever anticipated, setting the stage for a revelation that would upend everything they thought they knew about loyalty, identity, and the dangerous lengths some would go to protect their secrets. Alex barely had time to react before Emily started walking toward the diner, her expression unreadable, her movements too controlled, too deliberate, as if she had rehearsed this moment in her mind long before it ever happened. The woman across from him, the one who claimed to be Emily's first husband, had already slipped out of the booth, her chair scraping loudly against the linoleum floor before she rushed toward the back exit, muttering something under her breath that Alex barely caught. "You shouldn't have come." But he wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. His fingers clenched the marriage certificate still sitting on the table, the paper slightly crumpled from the way his hands had been shaking, and as Emily stepped through the door, his entire body tensed. He didn't know what he had expected: anger, maybe, or guilt, or even some desperate attempt at a lie to explain away the impossible truth staring him in the face, but she didn't give him any of that. She just smiled. "You're not supposed to be here, Alex," she said softly, sliding into the booth across from him, her tone disturbingly calm, as if they were just another married couple out for a late-night meal, as if she didn't know that the very foundation of their life together had just crumbled into something unrecognizable. Alex swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "Neither are you." Something flickered in her eyes, something he couldn't quite name. But before he could push further, before he could demand answers or confront her about the empty folder, the vanishing files, the phone call that warned him to stop, something outside caught his attention. The black SUV was still idling by the curb, its headlights cutting through the darkness. And for the first time, Alex noticed a second figure sitting in the driver's seat, barely visible behind the glare. Whoever they weren't looking at Emily. They were looking at him. A sharp, cold fear sliced through his chest. He had spent the past few days convincing himself that this was just a secret Emily had been keeping from him, a betrayal, a lie, a double life she hadn't meant for him to find out about. But now, sitting across from her, watching the way her fingers tapped absently against the tabletop, like she was waiting for something, he realized this was much, much bigger than that. Then, just as suddenly as she had arrived, Emily reached across the table and took his hand in hers. It was such a familiar gesture, so painfully normal, that for a second, Alex almost let himself believe that things were okay. But then she leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You need to stop looking," she said, her fingers tightening around his. "For your own good." And just like that, she stood up, slipping out of the booth with practiced ease, and walked back toward the door without another word. Alex sat frozen, his mind racing, every instinct screaming at him to follow her, to demand answers, to shake the truth out of her if he had to. But before he could even move, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The screen lit up with a single message from an unknown number. "She's not the only one lying to you." A shiver ran down his spine. Then, without warning, the lights in the diner flickered, the hum of the neon sign outside stuttering for just a moment before everything around him fell into an eerie silence. And that was when Alex knew this wasn't just about Emily anymore. Alex's breath came shallow as the diner's lights flickered back to life, bathing the cracked linoleum floor in a dull yellow glow. He stared down at his phone, his pulse hammering against his ribs, the message still glaring on the screen. "She's not the only one lying to you." The words gnawed at him, twisting everything he thought he knew into something far more sinister. Who sent this? And more importantly, who else had been deceiving him? His mind reeled, combing through the past few days, the past few years even, trying to pinpoint what he had missed. But before he could make sense of any of it, the air in the diner shifted. A presence. A shadow moving toward him. He looked up and felt his stomach drop. Mark. His best friend. His confidant. The one person he still believed he could trust. And yet, as Mark slid into the booth across from him, there was something different about him. His face was tight, his jaw clenched just a little too hard, and his eyes that had always been filled with a quiet steadiness, now carried something else entirely. "Alex," Mark said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to talk. Now." Alex could barely form the words. You're involved in this." Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing his hand down his face. "Not in the way you think." He hesitated, then leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Look, you need to understand something. Emily, she's not your biggest problem right now." Alex felt his skin go cold. What the hell does that mean? Mark glanced toward the window, as if checking for something or someone. The SUV was gone. Emily was gone, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left. "You've been looking for answers," Mark continued. "Digging too deep. Asking too many questions. That call you got, that wasn't just a warning. It was a final chance to walk away." Alex's fingers curled into fists. "Then tell me what the hell is going on?" Mark let out a slow, measured breath. And then, in the quiet of the diner, he said something that shattered everything. "You were never supposed to find out about any of this, Alex. Because it wasn't you they were hiding it from." For a moment, Alex just stared at him, his mind struggling to grasp the weight of those words. "What are you saying?" Mark's gaze darkened. "I'm saying Emily's been watching you just as much as you've been watching her. But not because she's afraid of you finding out her secrets, because she's afraid you'll remember yours." The words hit Alex like a freight train, knocking the breath from his lungs. His secrets? His memories? A sickening wave of nausea rolled through him as fragments of things blurred images, half-formed thoughts began clawing their way out of the depths of his mind. Something had been erased. Something had been buried. And now, for the first time, Alex wasn't just questioning Emily. He was questioning himself. Alex felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling, like reality itself was slipping between his fingers. He stared at Mark, searching his face for any sign that this was a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything to explain away the words that had just sent his world spiraling into something unrecognizable. But Mark didn't look uncertain. He looked exhausted, like he had been waiting for this moment, dreading it, knowing it would come eventually. "You need to tell me what you mean," Alex said, his voice strained, his grip tightening around the edge of the table, as if holding on to something solid would stop the world from tilting any further. What do you mean she's afraid I'll remember? Remember what? Mark exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face, before leaning in closer, lowering his voice even more. Alex, listen to me. You don't want to do this here. There are people watching, people who. He stopped abruptly, his eyes flickering past Alex toward the door, his entire body going rigid. Instinctively, Alex turned, his stomach lurching as he caught sight of another figure stepping into the diner. A man. Tall, built like someone who knew how to hurt people and didn't hesitate to do it. His dark eyes scanned the room with methodical precision before locking onto them. He didn't move right away. He just stood there watching. Waiting. Mark's fingers dug into Alex's arm, pulling his attention back. You need to leave, he muttered. Now? Walk out the back, don't stop, don't talk to anyone. I'll handle this. But Alex had had enough. He had spent the last few days drowning in half-truths, riddles, and warnings that led nowhere. He wasn't running anymore. Not until you tell me what the hell is going on, he said through gritted teeth. Mark clenched his jaw, his eyes darting back to the man at the door, who had now started moving toward them with a slow, deliberate pace. Damn it, Alex, this isn't the time. Then make it the time, Alex snapped, his voice a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through the tension coiling around them. Because I am done being kept in the dark. Either you tell me the truth, or I'll find it myself. Mark cursed under his breath, running a hand through his hair, before leaning in, his voice barely audible. You don't remember because you're not supposed to. That's the entire point. You went through something that was meant to be erased. Not hidden, not covered up. Erased. And Emily. She wasn't keeping secrets from you. She was keeping you from finding out about yourself. The words sent a bolt of ice through Alex's veins. That doesn't make sense, he murmured, shaking his head, even as something deep inside him screamed that it did. Doesn't it? Mark shot back. Think, Alex. The gaps in your memory. The things that don't add up. The fact that you've been looking for the truth when you don't even remember what you're looking for. Alex's heart pounded against his ribs. He had spent so much time convinced that Emily was the liar, the one with something to hide. But now, he wasn't sure of anything. What if she wasn't the villain in all of this? What if the real secret, the real danger, had been inside of him all along? A sharp vibration in his pocket nearly made him jump. Another message. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he pulled it out. It's time to choose. Walk away and forget, or keep going and lose everything. Decide now. A cold sweat broke out across his skin. Mark saw the message, and his face darkened. They're giving you one last chance, he said, his voice grim. You can leave this alone, go back to your life, pretend none of this ever happened. Or you can keep digging. He looked at Alex then, something almost pleading in his expression. But if you do, you won't like what you find. Alex's pulse roared in his ears as he looked from Mark to the approaching man, then back to his phone, the message still glowing on the screen like a warning carved into stone. He had to choose. His life or the truth. Alex's hands shook as he stared at the message on his phone, his mind screaming at him to stop, to turn back before it was too late. But it was already too late. The moment he found that first inconsistency in Emily's story, the moment he decided to dig deeper, he had already crossed the line. And now, as Mark sat across from him, his expression grim, and the man at the diner's entrance closed the distance between them, Alex knew one thing for certain. This was bigger than Emily. Bigger than him. Make a decision, Mark muttered under his breath. His fingers twitched against the table, his muscles coiled, ready to act. Because if you don't, they're going to make it for you. Alex's mind was a storm of questions, but one thing cut through the chaos, like a blade. Mark knew more than he was saying. He had been warning Alex, guiding him just enough without fully telling the truth. But why? Whose side was he really on? Before Alex could press him, the man from the entrance reached their table. His presence was suffocating, his eyes cold and assessing. He didn't need to introduce himself. He wasn't here for pleasantries. "Stand up," he ordered, his voice like gravel. "Come with me." Now, Alex's pulse slammed against his ribs. "And if I don't?" The man barely reacted. He just exhaled through his nose, as if already tired of the conversation. "Then you won't like what happens next." Mark shot Alex a warning glance, his fingers curling into fists. "Don't be stupid," he muttered. But Alex was done being controlled, done being afraid. He tightened his grip on his phone, his mind racing. Then, just as he was about to stand, a gunshot rang out. The diner erupted into chaos. People screamed, ducking under tables, chairs scraping against the floor as customers scrambled for cover. But Alex wasn't looking at them, he was looking at Mark. Because Mark had fired the shot, and the man who had been standing beside them now lay slumped on the ground, blood pooling around his chest. Alex's entire body locked up. "What the hell did you just do?" Mark didn't answer. He grabbed Alex by the arm and yanked him toward the back exit. "No time. Move." Alex barely had a second to process what was happening before they were outside, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. His ears still rang from the gunshot, his breath coming fast and uneven. But one thing became painfully clear in that moment. Mark wasn't just involved. He was a part of this. A big part. "Tell me the truth," Alex demanded, wrenching his arm free as they sprinted down the alleyway. "You've been playing me this whole time, haven't you? You and Emily, this was never about her. It was about me." Mark didn't stop running, but his expression twisted with something Alex couldn't place. "Guilt? Regret? You were supposed to stay asleep, Alex," he said, his voice rough, raw. "They worked so hard to make you forget. And now you're waking up." Alex's mind reeled. Forget what? Mark skidded to a stop near a side street, his chest heaving. Then he turned, his gaze locking onto Alex's. "The person you were before," he said. "The things you did. The reason they wiped your memory in the first place." Alex felt the world tilt. He had been so sure that Emily was the one living a double life, the one hiding something dangerous. But now, as Mark stood before him, revealing pieces of a truth that felt too massive to comprehend, Alex realized something chilling. This conspiracy wasn't just about him. He was at the center of it. And whoever they were, whoever had erased his past, they were coming for him. Alex's lungs burned as he ran, his mind a chaotic storm of fragmented memories and unanswered questions. The streets blurred around him, neon lights flashing in the distance, the cold night air slicing through his skin. Mark was just ahead, leading him through the darkened alleyways, like a man who knew exactly where he was going. But Alex wasn't sure he could trust him anymore. Had he ever been able to? Everything he thought he knew had shattered. Emily's deception wasn't about an affair or a secret life, it was about his past. A past that had been buried so deep, it felt like it belonged to someone else. The phone in his hand was still buzzing with messages, threats urging him to turn back, but he knew he couldn't. Not anymore. He needed answers. He needed the truth. Mark suddenly veered left, pulling Alex into a dimly lit warehouse, its metal walls echoing with distant hums of machinery. The moment the door slammed shut behind them, Mark spun around, his face twisted with urgency. "This is it," he said, his voice low, rough. "You want the truth? Then listen to me and don't freak out." Alex clenched his jaw, his fingers itching to throw a punch, to demand explanations instead of riddles. "I think I've earned the right to freak out, Mark." Mark exhaled sharply, then reached into his jacket. For a split second, Alex's instincts screamed that he was reaching for a gun, that this was it, This was the betrayal coming full circle. But instead, Mark pulled out a file. A thick, battered file with Alex's name printed in bold across the front. Alex's breath caught. His own name. Stamped. Official-looking. Government. His fingers trembled as he snatched it, flipping it open. And that's when the world cracked open. There, staring back at him, was a photo of himself. Not from a few years ago, not even from a decade ago, but from 20 years ago. Same face. Same eyes. Same man. Impossible. His chest tightened as he flipped through the documents. Reports. Medical records. Psychological evaluations. Everything detailed in cold, detached language, how he had been involved in something classified, something that had led to the erasure of his identity. Not just his memories. His entire existence. They didn't just make you forget, Mark said, watching Alex's face carefully. They reset you, gave you a new life, a new history. You were never supposed to remember. Alex's heartbeat pounded in his ears as he stared at the documents. It didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. He wasn't a soldier, or a spy, or some government experiment. He was just a regular guy. A man who had a wife, a normal life. Except, was he? Emily knew, Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. She knew this whole time. Mark hesitated, then nodded. She was assigned to you, Alex. To watch you. To make sure you didn't start asking questions. A sickening realization settled in his gut. Every conversation, every glance, every moment he had shared with Emily, it had all been a lie. Not because she was cheating, not because she had a second life, but because her entire purpose was to keep him from remembering his own. Rage surged through him, but before he could react, a metallic clang echoed from the far side of the warehouse. They weren't alone. Mark's eyes widened. They're here. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered to life, flooding the space with a harsh white glow. And then, from the shadows, Emily stepped forward. Alex's breath hitched as she met his gaze. She didn't look afraid. She didn't look guilty. She looked resigned. You were never supposed to find out, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of something final. Mark tensed beside him, his body coiled like a spring. But Alex barely noticed. His world had narrowed down to her, to the woman he had loved, the woman who had been by his side through everything and who had been lying to him from the very beginning. Tell me the truth, he demanded, stepping forward, his hands clenched into fists. All of it. Emily hesitated, but then she did something that knocked the air from his lungs. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a gun. She didn't aim it at him. She didn't even raise it. But the message was clear. Alex, you need to come with me, she said, before it's too late. Mark swore under his breath, reaching for his own weapon. You're not taking him. Emily's expression didn't change. He was never yours to protect, Mark. He belongs to them. Alex's mind spiraled. He had spent days trying to uncover Emily's secrets, only to find that the real danger was himself. And now, standing between Mark, who had been deceiving him in his own way, and Emily, the woman he had once trusted more than anyone, he realized the worst truth of all. He had no idea who the real enemy was. Alex stood frozen between two versions of the truth, his heart hammering, as he stared at Emily. The gun in her hand felt heavier than its actual weight, loaded not just with bullets, but with meaning, with consequences. On one side of him was Mark, a man who had killed to protect him, or to control him. On the other was Emily, the woman who had built his life with him, or had been assigned to. Neither of them were innocent. Neither of them had told him the whole truth. But there was one undeniable fact that shattered everything else he had been a lie from the start. He took a slow, measured breath, his hands curling into fists. No more games, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos raging inside him. No more lies. Who was I before? Emily flinched, just barely. Mark didn't. You were dangerous, Mark answered first. His voice was grim, carrying the weight of something irreversible. You were one of the best. And when you started asking questions when you wanted out, they wiped you clean. Started you over. But something must have gone wrong, because pieces of you started breaking through. Alex swallowed hard, his stomach churning. So, what now? I go back? Let them erase me again. Emily finally spoke, and when she did, there was something raw in her tone. They won't erase you, she whispered. Not this time. Alex felt the shift in the air before he even saw the movement. The distant sound of footsteps, shadows shifting behind the warehouse's metal walls. They were already here. He had wasted too much time. He had spent too long chasing answers, not realizing that the real battle wasn't about knowing the truth, it was about surviving it. Mark reached for his gun, but Alex stopped him, his grip tight on his wrist. He turned to Emily, his breath coming fast. You said I need to come with you. Why? She hesitated. Because it's the only way you live through this. Lies, Mark hissed. She's leading you into a cage. Emily shook her head. They won't kill you, Alex. But if you run, if you fight, they'll have no choice. Alex looked between them, his mind racing. His entire life, or at least the version he had been allowed to live, had been a carefully crafted illusion. He had never been a husband, an ordinary man with an ordinary life. He had been a ghost, a weapon, someone dangerous enough that the only solution was to erase him. And now, for the first time, he had a choice. He could run, disappear, try to forge something real from the wreckage of his past. Or he could go back, walk into the lion's den, and finally face the people who had stolen his identity in the first place. A noise outside. They were getting closer. Alex's pulse thundered. This was it. I'm done being someone else's creation, he said. And in that moment, he made his choice. The next few seconds blurred into movement. He turned fast, instinct taking over, grabbing Emily's gun before she could react. In the same breath, he slammed his elbow into Mark's ribs, knocking him back. He didn't hesitate. He ran. Bullets tore through the air as the warehouse doors burst open, men flooding inside. They had come to retrieve him. But Alex was no longer theirs to take. He ducked behind crates, his mind clear for the first time. He wasn't just surviving this. He was taking control. Emily's voice rang out over the chaos. Alex, stop. But he didn't stop. He didn't look back. He sprinted toward the emergency exit, dodging the gunfire, knowing that this wasn't the end, not even close. He had spent so long trapped in someone else's version of his life, tangled in secrets and manipulations. But now, as he disappeared into the dark streets beyond, there was only one certainty left. They had erased him once. They wouldn't get the chance to do it again. And as he vanished into the city, one last chilling thought settled deep in his chest. He still didn't know who he really was. But he was going to find out, no matter what it took.